Let's go to Matthew 23, 29 to 33. Jesus is still in the temple, and now he's coming to the last remarks that he's going to make in the temple before leaving. Notice Matthew chapter 23 and verses 29 to 33. These are the woes on the religious leaders, on the scribes and on the Pharisees. It says there, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets." Of course, they're planning on killing Jesus. And he continues saying, "Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets." And then he says, "Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt." What does that mean, fill up the measure? The cup is going to be what? Full. Do you know what that means? It simply means that their iniquity is complete. Remember in Genesis chapter 15 verse 16, it says the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full, so they couldn't enter the promised land because they had not sinned their day of grace away. By the way, in Revelation chapter 16, it speaks about 7 last plagues, and the cups have the fullness of the wrath of God. That means that they are unmixed with what? With mercy. And then Jesus says in verse 33, "Serpents, wow, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell?" But you know what's interesting? Even though this is happening a couple of days before the death of Jesus, there were still 3.5 years probation that Jesus was going to give to the Jewish nation even after he was crucified. Because the 70 weeks don't end when Jesus was crucified. The 70 weeks end in the year 34, 3.5 years later. So even after they killed Jesus, Jesus says, "I'm going to send you more messengers." You might call this a 4th stage of the history of Israel, although really it's part of the 3rd because it's part of the 70 weeks. You say, where does Jesus say that? Matthew 23, verses 34 to 36. Matthew 23, verses 34 through 36. "Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes." Prophet was Stephen, we're going to notice. The wise men, the 7 deacons, are called wise men. In other words, he sends additional messengers after the crucifixion of Jesus. Some of them, this is future, notice, some of them you what? You will kill and crucify. See, this is future from that point. "And some of them you will scourge in your synagogues," like they did with Peter and John in Acts chapter 2 and 3. "And persecute from city to city." Who was it that persecuted from city to city? Saul of Tarsus. And now notice, because you treat these messengers, these last messengers in this way, notice that the cup is full. Verse 35, "That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Is this the end of the Hebrew theocracy? Absolutely. Now, Jesus finishes his remarks to the scribes and Pharisees, and I want you to notice what happens. Matthew 23, verses 37 and 38. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often," we notice that he tried to woo them in the Old Testament twice, before the captivity, after the captivity. "How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." And now notice carefully, what was the temple when Jesus entered the temple for the final time as the Shekinah glory? It was the temple of God, and Jesus called it what? My house. But now notice the change. Verse 38. "See, your house is left to you what? Desolate." Did we see that word in the Old Testament? We most certainly. And what did their abominations lead to? To what? To desolation. By the way, do you know where Jesus went after he left the temple? He went to the same place that the Shekinah went after the Shekinah left the temple in Ezekiel's time. Is this all coincidence? No, it's not coincidence at all. Notice Matthew 24 and verse 1. Matthew 24, verse 1. It says, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple." Why was the temple desolate? because the Shekinah was no longer there. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And then Jesus speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem. Why was Jerusalem destroyed? Because they rejected Jesus. Let's read it in Matthew 24, verses 2 and 3. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Surely I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, as he sat where? Oh, the Shekinah's on the Mount of Olives now. He's forsaken the temple. And so it says, now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And then Jesus begins giving his sermon, his famous sermon on the Mount of Olives. And I want you to notice what Jesus predicted. We'll only read Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15. Listen carefully. The two key words that we find in the prophecy of the 70 weeks is contained here in Matthew 24 and verse 15. And then Luke 21 explains what this means. Notice what Jesus says. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation," are those words that we found in the Old Testament? Yes. When you see the abomination of desolation, and if you're thinking this has nothing to do with Daniel, Jesus says, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. "Standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." What Jesus was referring to was the Roman armies had surrounded the city of Jerusalem. They had placed their standards, which had an eagle, in the ground, and they were worshiping their standards. And the interesting thing is that God had told his people, if you continue reading there in Matthew 24, God has told his people, when you see this sign, the abomination of desolation, make sure you flee the city so that you're not destroyed when the city is destroyed. Was there a work of separation that took place before the city was destroyed? Absolutely. Not one Christian, we're told in great controversy, perished in the destruction of Jerusalem, because they had been separated before the destruction came, just like happened in the Old Testament. Now, what does this mean when you see the abomination of desolation? It's actually the Roman armies that surrounded Jerusalem. You say, how do we know that? Luke 21 and verse 20. Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. Here Jesus teaches the same thing, but he uses different words. In Matthew, he said, when you see the abomination of desolation, but now notice what he says. But when you see Jerusalem, what? Surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. What were those armies that surrounded Jerusalem that gave the signal to those who were inside that they needed to flee in order not to be destroyed? It was the Roman armies. And you say, how could they flee if they had the city surrounded? Well, Josephus tells us that for some unexplained reason, we know what it was God's providence. The Roman armies suddenly left. And the Jews inside the city, they said, hey, this is a signal that God is with us. And they went after the Romans. And the Romans suffered many losses. Do you know what the Christians did when the Romans departed? They all escaped to the mountains of Judea, just like Jesus said. And then the Romans came back. And they destroyed the city. And they destroyed the temple.